Mhm. not get shortchanged on payday by sneaky hidden fees. Get wise.
Folks, I have absolutely fantastic news. The United States Supreme Court, just for good measure, not one case, but two separate cases, one out of Chicago, one out of to hear whether or not the AR-15 and modern sporting rifles are protected by the Second. Folks, I have absolutely fantastic. The United States Court, for good, in one case, but two separate cases, one out of Chicago, one out of Connecticut, has agreed to hear whether or not the AR-15 and modern sporting rifles are protected by the Second Amendment. It's really hard to say that it gets much bigger than this, because for years, dozens of states, hundreds of jurisdictions have been doing their utmost to ban America's #1 most selling popular firearm that's used for sporting, self-defense, you name it. So goes the AR-15 in many respects, so goes the Second Amendment. It's truly, folks, the canary in the coal mine, because all of the logic that can be used to attack the AR-15, people say it's this, it's that, it looks scary, you name it. If that logic and if those lines of attack are allowed to stand, I think they're going to. Because I tell you one thing, it's not going to end with the AR-15. Because statistically, AR-15s, if you look at the actual misuse and homicide across the country, keep in mind, there's at least over 32 million AR-15 modern sporting rifles out there in circulation today. The FBI does not even track a separate crime statistic for misuse of AR-15s and homicides. There's between about 300 to 400 homicides by way of rifle every single year in America, and about 60 total AR-15s misused in homicides every single year. But to contextualize that, more people drown in bathtubs or swimming pools. More people are killed by lawnmowers, falling off ladders, or getting stung by bees. And I don't mean combined, I mean individually. More people are killed with kitchen knives and cutlery than AR-15s. AR-15s, statistically, are actually some of the safest firearms that you can possibly have. But never mind the logic, because now we're going to be going to the United States Supreme Court. This happened in what's called a cleanup conference, where we know the justices have been kicking all sorts of different things about whether or not they can take certain cases on their docket. Looking ahead to the next, I feel like calling it the Supreme Court season. Keep in mind, they only have the bandwidth to accept about 1.5% to 2.5%, give or take, of all cases that are actually appealed to them. So when they keep kicking the can down the road, it doesn't mean it's the end of the road, because we actually had this teased a lot coming up for us. Before we get there, let's just quickly detour through the cases. The first one is Viramontes versus Cook County. So for those of you who do not live near or around Illinois, or sometimes, as you know, I like to call it the Mordor of the Midwest, Cook County out of the Chicago area. Viramontes is challenging the federal court. He actually filed a lawsuit back in 2021 and argued that Cook County's ban on semi-automatic rifles violates his right to keep and bear arms, otherwise known, of course, as the Second Amendment. The lower courts upheld the ban because they leaned on a Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. That's the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals that oversees Illinois and a handful of other states, including my beloved Wisconsin. Because that case, Beavis versus Naperville, which you've heard me talk about a lot, and we followed it through as going through, that, hey, Seventh, that it's fine. So the lower court said, we're not going to overturn this. That's the reason why their only option was to wind up going through to the United States Supreme Court. The court claimed that the banned rifles were close enough to machine guns and military weaponry that the government could prohibit them if they so chose. Viramontes asked the Supreme Court to step in and clean up the confusion that the lower courts have created by how to apply the Supreme Court's Bruin test. That's the history tradition test that we know that the anti-gunners love to hate on. More videos on that coming up. The second case is called Grant versus Higgins, which is out of Connecticut. Connecticut passed its own ban in the wake of the 2012 tragedy at Sandy Hook. Gun owners and gun rights groups have been challenging this for quite some time, and a federal court refused to block the law. The Second Circuit ended up upholding it, calling these rifles unusually dangerous, because keep in mind, there is out there in jurisprudence land, certain weapons can be banned if they are deemed to be unusually dangerous. Unusual and dangerous, okay? We've done lots of videos talking about the history of that. We're not going to detour in that right now. But the challengers made an argument that cuts basically right to the heart of the entire fight. They told the court that a firearm cannot be banned if it is in common use for lawful purposes, citing to the 2008 case DC versus Heller, and of course 2010 the United States Supreme Court case in McDonald, and of course later on the United States Supreme Court again in Catano, and of course later on again the United States Supreme Court case in Bruin. Right, there's some precedent on that. And let's face it, when you have a rifle that's more common than the Ford F-150 pickup truck, which is the #1 selling pickup truck in the country, difficult to say we can ban the #1 most selling rifle. If a firearm is in common use, it is now going to be constitutionally protected. Now, I mentioned before, a little Easter egg a couple moments ago, about the fact that we kind of saw this was coming. How did we know this? Well, spoiler alert, none of this came out of nowhere. Just over a year ago, Maryland's ban in a case called Snope versus Brown. Again, we covered that here. But 3 judges, Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, and Neil Gorsuch, said on the record that they would have taken that case right then and there. And a 4th justice, Brett Kavanaugh, wrote separately. Justice Kavanaugh called the lower court ruling that upheld the ban questionable, and he said that the Supreme Court should and presumably will address the AR-15 issue soon in the next term or 2. Here we are. Now, that was not some sort of casual aside. That was a sitting justice telling you, look, folks, it's coming. I talked about it then. I've trickled it in ever since, and just over a year later, here we are. You can expect to get a decision about the constitutionality of the AR-15s coming probably about this time, June in 2027. And folks, the stakes, again, could not be higher. Because again, common use is what the constitutional standard is when it comes to whether or not a firearm is protected from bans, from regulations, from exactly the sort of thing that we have seen not only in Illinois, Connecticut, but in so many other states as well. In the 2008 Heller decision, the court held that the Second Amendment protects weapons that are in common use for lawful purposes by law-abiding citizens. And as already mentioned, again in the 2016 Catano decision, the court reinforced it and made it very clear that the protection extends to arms that did not exist at the time of the founding, as long as they are bearable and ordinary people commonly own today. And I'll just reference that in the Catano decision, we're talking about 32 million, and that's the low number. That's the conservative number, okay? 32 million AR-15s. In the Catano decision, they're talking about stun guns, which are measured by the hundreds of thousands, and they decided that those were in common use. Are you getting to get the feel for why I'm so excited about this? The test is not whether the gun looks like it could be in the military, or if it looks frightening, or what color it is. The test is whether everyday law-abiding people actually own it and keep it. And by that test, the AR-15 is second to none. Second to none. I already hit the statistics about the fact that it might be arguably one of the absolute safest firearms by crime statistics according to the FBI. It really doesn't get any better. Except it does. What am I talking about? There was a decision that you heard me here talk about from the United States Supreme Court, okay? You got to understand, let me step back for a moment, that the anti-gun attack it's not protected by the Second Amendment. Okay, it's not in common use, it's dangerous, unusual, all that kind of stuff, right? I mean, they literally argue everything, all right? In the 2025 Smith & Wesson case, this was the case where Smith & Wesson appealed to the United States Supreme Court because the nation of Mexico was suing them, basically trying to put them, and I'll add a lot of other manufacturers, out of business. And the Supreme Court said no. They actually sided, all 9 justices, I'll add, sided with Smith & Wesson. But importantly, they described the AR-15 as widely legal, bought by ordinary citizens, and the most popular rifle in the country. This is on record. And even Justice Sotomayor, who I don't think most people would confuse as being highly endorsed by the NRA, GOA, or other Second Amendment groups, in her 2024 Cargill dissent, called these rifles commonly available. The common use question may already be answered by the court's own words, and most importantly, the typical anti-gun justices, they've already signed on. You can actually just quote them. So that's a pretty interesting place to be when it comes to the AR-15, and we have some very interesting times ahead. I've been very excited about this happening. I knew it was going to be coming. I did not think it was going to be coming today. I was not prepared to go live for this, but just the same, I'm very excited to share this news with you. Be sure to hit that like button, share the video around. Let me know in the comments section down below what you think is going to come from this. As I've said before, and I'll mention again, I believe this is going to be the most pro-Second Amendment court that we will ever get, at least foreseeably that we will ever get. So I'm very excited to be watching them get 1 and 2, sometimes even 3 pro-Second Amendment cases together in any given term. It's harder to get better than that, all right? I'm very excited about the direction of this. We're gonna close out with our ever popular quote of the day. This one comes from Sam Adams, not the beer, Samuel Adams, one of the founding fathers, at the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention back in 1788, who said, when they were debating about whether or not they're going to ratify what we now call the United States Constitution, quote, "The Constitution shall never be construed to prevent the people of the United States who are peaceable citizens from keeping their own arms." Well, here, Sam, and here's to you as well. I appreciate you tuning in. Thank you very much. Again, I look forward to seeing your comments. Thanks for joining me here today. Folks, we've been on quite a ride. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Take care.
He is a 5th-generation rancher in California's San Joaquin Valley, one of the country's most esteemed historians of the ancient world, and a pundit on contemporary affairs. The remarkable Victor Davis Hanson on Uncommon Knowledge now. Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. A senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, Victor Davis Hanson is the author of more than 24 books, including his classic study of the Peloponnesian War, A War Like No Other, his history of the Second World War, which is titled The Second World Wars, and his book on contemporary America, The Dying Citizen. In 2020 and 2021, Dr. Hanson, who holds his doctorate in classics from Stanford, right here, in 2020 and 2021, he served on the President's Advisory 1776 Commission. Victor, thank you for driving down from the Valley.
Thank you.
July 4th, 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. First question to you as a historian. The flourishing of democracy in Athens in the 5th century BC, the rule of law as enshrined in Justinian's Code in the 6th century, Magna Carta in 1215. Where does the Declaration of Independence stand? Is it a world historical event like those?
It is. They were a little different in that if you look at Athenian democracy, they were talking about a equitable system among citizens. And they said things like we enshrine isagoria, the ability to speak in the assembly regardless of your status, but meaning if you were a free person.
If you were a free male.
Yes, a free person. And Magna Carta was about nobles and people like that that had property rights, and they were exempt from arbitrary search. All these were compounded and absorbed by our Constitution. But the idea that innately every single person, even though it wasn't true in America at the fact, was born equal, that's a radical concept. And the only thing I can think of in the entire corpus of antiquity was someone like the orator Alcidamus said, "No man is born a slave." That's about as close as it comes. Aristotle, slavery is okay if you get the right people as slaves, natural slaves. Slavery wasn't based on race in the ancient world. It was by misadventure. You were in a city that was captured or you were born. But this is the first document, and that was very important because where the Constitution's Bill of Rights did not include that all people, regardless of race, shall be treated equally. There was no amendment to that extent. The Declaration statement, by the time of the abolitionist and Frederick Douglass, they had an argument that said, we're not thinking of anything new. We're just asking you people to abide by your declaration, not ours. You were the ones that said that. So please just honor it. And it was a very powerful argument.
Two quotations. Here's the late Bernard Bailyn of Harvard. Quote, "The primary goal of the American Revolution was the preservation of political liberty that was threatened by the apparent corruption of the Constitution, that is, of the British Constitution, and the establishment in principle of the existing conditions of liberty." Here's historian Philip Deloria, also of Harvard, is quoted in the Ken Burns documentary, The American Revolution, quote, "I think the American Revolution was all about land. It's easy to make the political kinds of arguments, but I think underpinning all of that was the possibility of expansion." The founders really and truly believed in liberty, or all they wanted was a land grab.
Well, to address the latter point, I think he's taken a truth and made it the truth. So when you read letters that Thomas Jefferson wrote, he said things like, this country will not work unless we have enough land for an independent agrarian. Not an agriculturalist or a farmer, an agrarian. That word goes back to Greece, which means people had roughly equal plots in a middle class. And then you had people like Washington was one of the biggest landowners, and they understood already the immense potential of the Ohio Valley, and they understood they were going to do this. So yes, but it wasn't quite, we're going to go create agribusiness. If you read what the founders said, and particularly Jefferson, and you read contemporary literature about them, like John de Crevecoeur, Letters from an American Farmer, or Alexis de Tocqueville writing, the 1832 1 or 2, they said things like, it's been a miracle that the United States avoided the two-class system of Europe, of masters and peasants, or owners and serfs, or indentured people. In the United States, because they had such available land, they created the first autonomous agrarian class. And when you look at people like John Adams, in classical references, they went back to classical Athens and said that the mesoi, the middle people, the hoplites, the men in the assembly, they had the right to speak as anybody else in the assembly. They had the right to fight in the hoplite phalanx, equal distance to each other, and their parcels were roughly the same size. So that was a deep Western idea, an idealism that the ideal democracy, Aristotle said, was one of agrarians. And he said they combined muscle with brain. They're completely independent. They had property. They had property. They wanted to pass it on and improve it to their children. It was protected. You could argue that property was probably one of the driving influences or catalysts for the beginning of democracy in Greece. But in American, I think Bernard Bailyn is absolutely right. What he was talking about was liberty, and that word really doesn't have an equivalent in the Greek language, libertas. The Greek closest is eleutheria, and that means freedom. But liberty,
Roman concept.
yeah,
Romans are the ones
it's a
who work
Roman
it out.
concept, and it means that you are free regardless. And there's people who talked about in Rome. He said, well, you know, the Germans are free because they have such they do whatever they want. The American Indians were free, but liberty is a different idea. Liberty means that you're free within the confines of a sophisticated society and competing interests. But there was a natural freedom that was very attractive to Tacitus all the way to Rousseau and Voltaire. That the noble savage were free. They didn't have any encumbrances upon them. They just roamed. They were transient, nomadic. But liberty, the Romans, and they knew this, they said, but liberty is a sophisticated civilization where a person has, you know, the rights of habeas corpus, or the rights to vote, or the right to speak.
So liberty exists only within a system of law.
Yes, and civilization.
Property and law.
Yes.
All right.
And then the other thing, very quickly, when they talk about liberty, it had become an antithetical in some ways to not just freedom in the classical, but equality. So people were saying they understood that once you gave people liberty, you gave people liberty to be better than somebody, to make more money than somebody, and to be protected from acquisition or confiscation. 10 years later, after in France, it was egalitarianism and fraternity, and that was an equality result movement, so that we're going to remake the world at year zero. We're going to rename the days of the week, the days of the month, get rid of the church, we're going to worship. It was a holistic cultural, social, military, political, economic revolution. This wasn't. So ours wasn't.
It's fair to understand the American Revolution. This is a paradox, but it's right at the heart of things. The American Revolution is a conservative revolution.
It is.
The founders wanted to defend the rights and the freedom of assembly, the property they had already developed, the legal systems that existed in the colonies. They wanted to defend the rights that had already developed in the colonies, as opposed to the French Revolution, which wanted to wipe everything away and start anew.
Yes, and that's why we avoided. What's remarkable about the American Revolution is there were only there was 7,000 or 8,000 deaths in the Revolutionary War, but even after people had driven the Loyalists up to Canada, there was very little killing. It wasn't like the French Reign of Terror of 1793. There was no person, maybe Tom Paine at the most radical, and when he went over to France to see if they would welcome him as a Jacobin, they almost killed him. So they were so much more radical than Robespierre's brother.
I've always puzzled by this. The first American victory, the first major American victory in the war, is when Washington puts up, they bring down the guns, the British guns from Fort Ticonderoga,
Yes.
was it?
Yes.
And Washington emplaces these things on the heights overlooking Boston. And General Howe wakes up and sees that Washington permits the British to withdraw peacefully. He does not open fire on them.
Yeah.
As I recall, the argument is that even some large British ships were within range. He could have opened fire, sunk some ships, caused devastation among the redcoats on the ground. That news would have gone back to Parliament and rattled Britain, but Washington doesn't do that. Why?
Well,
Washington lets them go.
yeah, he thought that the British were mistaken. He did not think they were evil. He thought that they were misplaced. He thought that they would learn from what they were doing in the United States. People in the Revolution and the founders thought that they would make a city up on a hill, and that people in England would see that the parliamentary system, which was fair within the confines of Britain compared to the alternative in Europe, that maybe they would learn from them. They really did believe that they were creating a superior system, but not antithetical necessarily, but derivative from the part. And they, at that time, contrary to a lot of the woke ideologies today, about 90% of the people in the colonial were from Scotland or England or Wales.
Right.
90% white, 10% probably African slaves, but there were very few other people. Yet that didn't come for another 30 years and 40 years, 50. The German...
Right up until the Declaration, they thought of themselves as British.
They did.
They had the rights of Britons.
They did. There was very little diversity, and it was a derivative of the British system. And you can see that after the War of 1812, and a little bit of a flirtation with Britain during the Civil War that for mercantile reasons flirted with the South. Right. We were pretty much bound by tradition and history, the British and the Americans, as we are today.
The Constitution, from the Declaration to the Constitution, drafted in Philadelphia from late spring to early autumn of 1797. That is just an amazing fact to me. These guys got together and put together the Constitution of the United States over a summer. Yeah, on break, so to speak. It's ratified in 1788. The first 10 amendments, which we now call the Bill of Rights, are in turn ratified 3 years later in 1791. The late Justice Antonin Scalia, quote, "Every tin-horn dictator in the world today has a Bill of Rights. It isn't our Bill of Rights that produces freedom, it's the structure of our government." You agree with that?
Yeah, I think they started with, unlike the French, that was influenced by Voltaire or Rousseau, that man was created as a wonderful creature. And then I think Rousseau said man was born in shackles. We moved the shackles. He was born in shackles. So they felt that religion, that government, that all of these civilized encumbrance had warped people. The founders felt that we were flawed in the Christian sense. And therefore, I think it was Madison or Adams, both of them in different variations, said if man was perfect, we wouldn't need this Constitution. But they believed he was flawed. And inevitably, what they were most worried about was somebody who was very gifted, rhetorically wealthy, powerful, magnetic, would abuse the system and take power. So they deliberately did this derivative of Montesquieu, and Montesquieu really got the idea from the Spartan Constitution.
Really?
Yeah, Spartan Constitution.
There were two kings.
Yes. Go ahead. That came into the two councils at Rome, and the Romans said the Cretan and the Spartan Constitution were superior to the Athenian. So basically, in Sparta, you had executive, the kings, you had judicial oversight from them, the ephors, and then you had a lower house, the people, the ecclesia, and then you had an upper house of the bulle, and these were the Spartiate. And the idea was to check power, and that came to Rome with the two consuls, to check each other. And then you had the tribal assemblies, and then you had praetors and people in the judicial branch. And so that came into the French, and Montesquieu was, the spirit of laws. And so that was very influential on our founders, and they felt that if there was a powerful executive, he could be checked by the Supreme Court. He could be checked by the legislature. He could check the legislature. He could veto. He could check the Supreme Court by nominating, and back and forth. It would be impossible for someone, and I think, to take control over the government. And the only time that I think came close was somebody who was a brilliant politician, magnetic, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he was the first and only person to be elected 3 and 4 times.
And yet even he, when he attempted to pack the Supreme Court,
yes,
there was an uproar.
They checked him. Yeah, absolutely. Right. And you can see this today is when people want to have aggrandizement of power. What do they do? Right now the Democratic Party is in flux. I don't want to be too political, but they're looking at the system, and they're thinking this system is not conducive to our agenda. Given our agenda, we can't win 51. So what do? Let's change the system.
Let's eliminate these checks and balances on us.
Yes. So we want to get rid of the Electoral College. And they didn't read any of the arguments in the Federalist Papers why we had an Electoral College. And they're numerous. And the National Voting Compact they're pushing said that any legislature that with a majority vote can accept the federal ballot count, not their own state. And they will vote according to the federal. And if they're only about 2 states away from, I think it's unconstitutional, but they want to get rid of the Electoral College. 237 years. They want to get rid of the 169-year, 9 justice court. They want to get rid of, and you can argue how old, 183, 220 years filibuster in the Senate. They want to bring in 2 states, make Washington, D.C. a state, and Puerto Rico, and get 4 senators. So anytime you see a party that wants to change the system and kind of get out of this checks and balances and get out of the sidelines and play out in the bleachers, then you've got to be, they either have an agenda that won't appeal to 51% of the people, or they want to change the system. And it's kind of ironic because they accuse the right of doing that. But when the right, they could do it right now. They could get rid of the filibuster. They're the majority, and they won't do it.
From a column you wrote a few years ago, a quote, I'm quoting you, "Other republics, that is outside the United States, other republics birthed parliamentary systems." That is not a system like ours where you've got a president and legislature, but the parliamentary system, the prime minister is part of the legislature. So you've got a single body that combines the executive and legislative. But I'm going to continue to quote you. "They're usually characterized by sudden creations and collapses of ruling governments, depending on volatile public mood swings. Few consensual governments have ever emulated the more difficult American model, and thus so far never achieved a 247-year continuity of a single republican system," close quote. What intrigues me there is that phrase, the more difficult American model.
Yeah, it is, because when you have an unpopular government, you have a timeline when they can schedule elections, and then if the government is doing bad in their version of the midterms or regional elections, they can assuage the problem by just having the person step down. So as we were speaking, Stormer in Britain hasn't scheduled an election, but he's been wiped out at the polls regionally.
Prime Minister.
Yes, so they can do what they did to Margaret Thatcher. They can just remove him. That would be
His own party in the parliament.
That's absurd. I mean, when the closest we've ever come, really, in the modern period was when Joe Biden had a bad debate, and the politicos of the party decided to remove him from what would have been an automatic nomination on the ticket.
Right.
And then substitute. So he was forced to announce that he was not going to run for re-election, and then they didn't have an open election. They kind of coronated Kamala Harris, even though she had been a candidate in 2020 and had not won a single delegate. And therefore, they nullified the 14 million votes that had voted for Biden in the primaries. And that was a big crisis that helped the opposition, because we don't do that. So it's impossible in the United States, unless there's a death of a president, for a president to be commander-in-chief without having been voted in that office. That's not true in Britain. So it's more ideas and parties. And the other thing is their system, because of the parliamentary way it works, they have all these multiple parties. And we have a third party kind of a safety valve for people, but it's never been successful. So we have a very steady two-party system. We have regularly scheduled elections. We have a House and Senate that have very clear rules about you have to live in the state if you're a senator. You can live out of your district, and how old you're, 26 or 30. It's all there, and and there's so many checks and balances that this came up during the Iraq flirtation with nation building, and people wanted to know, should we imprint our system? And they very quickly said no.
Ours is too hard.
The Iraqis are not up to it. Just have a parliament and let them just fight and get a bunch of sections and factions, and then they'll get a prime minister, and then just give him a general view that maybe in the next 5 years he has to call an election.
Victor, you are many things, as I indicated in when I introduced you. A farmer, a pundit, but you're a classicist.
Yes.
And again, I'm struck. These men, and they were all men, put together the Constitution of the United States over one summer. And instead of simply copying the British system, what we had established was that we were independent. It would have been very easy, far the easiest thing to do. We had someone everyone agreed should be the executive. It would have been very easy to make George Washington king, start a line, and simply reproduce the British system and say, we're a different country. We now have our own king and our own parliament. And instead, they came up with these checks and balances, a president, a bicameral legislature, and a judiciary. And again, as one hears you talk about it, it comes through Montesquieu, back to Rome, back to Greece.
Yeah, there were two instrumental books that they read. One was Cicero's philosophical works, De Republica, where he outlined different types of government. And there had been, since the Renaissance, Latin translations of Aristotle's Politics, and he gives you a typology of this is democracy type 1, 2, 3, 4. This is oligarchy, and he critiques the advantages and disadvantages in a very disinterested and empirical way. Mm-hmm. And he's very critical of Athenian democracy.
The founders had read that.
What? Yes. Well, not all of them read Greek, although there was an emotion, as you remember, that some people thought the national official language of the United States should be classical Greek. But we know that Jefferson did. He claimed, I'm not sure he did it. He said he read a page or two of Thucydides every morning. John Adams knew Greek. I don't think Washington did. Hamilton did. But the point I'm making is that they would have been familiar with Cicero's more abstract and then they would have read Plutarch's Lives, probably in Latin, that had been translated. And that gave them actual examples of Caesar, Cicero, Alexander the Great, Pompey, all these different people, Aristides the Just, Epaminondas. And from what we can tell, a lot of the people that in the parallel lives, they're not just Alexander. Every Greek is compared to a Roman.
Yes.
Alexander and Caesar, Demosthenes, Cicero, things like that. And they could get examples of what made people fail and what made people succeed. And it had a profound...
So these men were not only literate, they took history seriously.
Yeah, I think
something
more so.
from which they could learn practical lessons. They understood to varying extents, but they took a degree of classical knowledge among each other for granted.
It's very different than today. We read history books to be entertained or be educated, but we don't do it for emulation. We don't say, I want to read about William Tecumseh Sherman's memoir. I want to read his memoir so I can see if I could be like him.
I want to be.
Or what he did wrong, or I want to be what he did right. Well, that was didactic literature is classical literature. So people wrote things like Plutarch or Caesar's Gallic Wars. Here's how you deal with tribal people. Or Cicero, here's how you can do it. It was very practical and
history in the ancient world were how-to manuals.
Yes, and inspirational. And so, I mean, there were things that were written in poetry and novels that were entertaining, but the founders took it very seriously, that they were models of the ancient world of both bad and good, and they tried to avoid the latter and emulate the latter and avoid the former, and they were very successful at it.
All right, the objections to the founding. Slavery. At the time of the Declaration, Americans owned 500,000 slaves. Jefferson himself owns about 200. Nicole Hannah-Jones, quote, "Some might argue that this nation was founded not as a democracy, but as a slaveocracy," close quote. So we have the Declaration and the Constitution. These documents and this nation were compromised from the get-go by hypocrisy on race. How do you handle that argument?
There's something to it, but we got to remember, first of all, when Jefferson wrote the Declaration, he wanted an insertion in it about the equality of people regardless of their status.
We have that. He drafted
Yes, he drafted it, and he was very upset that they...
Very explicit anti-slavery
Yes,
statement.
and they excised it.
Right.
In fact, the only reference in either of those two documents is probably one of the most misunderstood about the 3/5 clause, about how congressional districts should use the census, and the South wanted this ridiculous position that they didn't want any rights at all to slaves, but they wanted to count them so they could get increased congressional districts of which the slaves would have no vote over, and that was a deadlock. And so the compromise, the Northerners said, well, you're hypocrites, but we're not going to let you do that, but you can count them 3/5. And then after that, it came, well, you were only valuing people 3/5. But it was a Northern argument to give them full value.
To contain the institution, to contain the
power
power itself.
And so the problem was with Hannah-Jones is if you put in the Declaration of Independence, and it was signed, and it says all men are created equal, and that was the basis for your rebellion against Britain. Of course, Britain used this argument that they had abolished slavery and we hadn't. But when you put that in, then it's an evolutionary idea, and so everybody looks back at the Declaration. It was Frederick Douglass who said to Lincoln, a black man didn't write that. You did. So obviously you want to give us slaves. You just haven't. We've heard for 50, 60, 80 years where you can't do it now because of compromises. What would you do to the South? I think one of the things that's never discussed is when they started the idea of the United States, they were very aware of the 30 Years' War, the 7 Years' War, the 100 Years' War, of a continent in Europe that was roughly the same size. They talked about it. And they said if we have 30 or 40 countries, it's going to be constant warfare, religious warfare, racial war, everything. So there was a manifest destiny. They didn't know how far they would be able to consolidate one country, but they were already worried about Mexico, the Spanish Empire, and Canada, the people who went up. So all of their private correspondence said we've got to compromise, and because of the nature of tobacco and cotton and the proximity of the South to the Caribbean, there were slaves there, and this was antithetical both to the sensibilities of the North, who came not from the Scottish-Irish tradition as much, but more from England and Wales, and then more importantly, they had a different type of agriculture that was smaller and didn't have the plantation system, and you couldn't reconcile those two positions and still have a United States without tabling that question for another generation. And that was basically the story of the Missouri Compromise, the Great Compromise. Every compromise in the Senate and the House was trying to
kick that can down the road, to hold it all together.
Yes.
So despite this clarion statement, we hold these truths to be self-evident. The Declaration, and even more so in some ways the Constitution, were practical documents. The first imperative was to hold this new thing, this new country together.
Solidify it and then work internally to eliminate slavery. But you remember that people in the South, by 1850 and 60s, people like Joan Breckinridge, the vice president, or John C. Calhoun, they were making the argument that they were the followers of the Declaration because they said God made all people. I mean, we declare all people are equal, but they're not all equal. They're just white people are equal. So people forget that the Confederate separatists were using the Declaration to say that the North had betrayed that because it said all men are created equal in the United States, but everybody knew that they weren't equal, and they were trying to make people equal who weren't.
Victor, let me...
Very sick argument, but they tried to do that.
I have a longish question here. I want to set it up and see how you respond to this. We've talked about the issue of race at the founding itself. Here's Frederick Douglass in 1860. The Civil War is just about to break out. Quote, if in its origin slavery had any relation to the government, it was only as the scaffolding to the magnificent structure to be removed as soon as the building was completed. So there we have just the idea that you've been outlining, that what was bad in the founding is temporary and contingent, and what was good about the founding, this recognition of human dignity as inherent in all peoples, is permanent.
Yes.
Okay. Now, as best I understand it, for at least a century after Douglass, that remains the dominant view. Martin Luther King Jr., here he is in the I Have a Dream speech.
When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir.
How did we go from Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King Jr. to Nicole Hannah-Jones?
Because Martin Luther King said that one day he wanted his children to be adjudicated by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. So that generation, Ralph Abernathy, all of them, had come out of the 50s, and they were very, they had their first great victory was integration during the Korean War, and then it was voting in the North without poll taxes. But then, basically, they saw that the North was their model for the South, the northern states, and they wanted to work within the system, and there wasn't a repertory idea that they owe us something. Just King said, just give us an equal playing field, equality of opportunity. That morphed under Lyndon Johnson, the Great Society, and that said, once we had the Civil Rights Act of 64 and 65, there were people who were naive enough who said, now we're not going to have to worry about race anymore. But because, and Tom Sowell's written very eloquently of this, that the way that those programs of the Great Society were implemented, they staggered or slowed down what had been a pretty parallel course, even given the evils of Jim Crow and segregation, because of the adversity factor, and that people in the black communities' rates of abortion, divorce, single parenthood was not that much different than poor whites of the same economic. But everything changed when human nature, what it is, people said, change that, and they said, you have been wrong forever, and we are sorry, and we want to do this for you and do this for you, and we know we're not supposed to make congressional districts by race, but we're going to do it just for you. And we know that we don't identify primarily by our superficial appearance, but we're going to do it to you. And so all of a sudden, the idea that people were saying, I'm white, and that was bad, because they were racial essentialism. Now it was, I'm black and that's good. And so we veered off that, and now we institutionalized it for 60 years. So if you suggest to somebody, and a good example of this is the recent Supreme Court ruling say you cannot redistrict a congressional seat or district on the basis purely of race. Well, everybody would agree with that. But we've created this huge 50-person black caucus,
right?
And they can't believe that anybody would ever question that they were elected, even when you make the argument to them. Well, if you're a Tim Scott or somebody who's
Tim Scott,
yeah, blacks have been successful. Going back to Senator Brooke in Massachusetts, the worst thing you can do for a particular group is to create a congressional district of everybody who looks alike or thinks alike, and then have two candidates that just try to be more extreme than the other, and then they never are able to evolve out of that seat, because if they get into a statewide race, they lose. And that was what was so unique about Barack Obama. He lost, I think it was to Bobby Rush in a congressional district, and he was, I guess you would say, out-radicalized, even Obama. But then he appealed to, his eloquence, and he didn't govern that way, but he ran statewide as a healer.
In Illinois.
There is no red state, there is no blue state, there's just the United. And what I'm getting at is, if you looked at it empirically, it would be the best thing for the African American community, because then they could have all sorts of candidates that appeal to diverse people, and they wouldn't be fighting in these districts that make them so radical. They're out of the mainstream. And so I think there'll be good of it, because there'll be candidates that will win. I mean, after all, in 2008, Barack Obama got more white votes than John Kerry got in 2004. So,
And Tim Scott, you mentioned Tim Scott.
yes, 3
Black
times.
Republican who represents South Carolina, which is a white majority state. He beat Strom Thurmond's son in the primary during his first campaign, as I recall. All right.
And the irony of Tennessee is that the single black their black specialty district
In Memphis?
yes, it's a white representative that holds it. So, a very quick thing about slavery. One of the things I think also retarded the elimination of slavery in the United States is that, and to a certain extent in the West, that when you look for great books, discussions of it, even in early Christian fathers, or you looked in the classical world, you don't see it very often, if at all. And one of the reasons you don't was this: we in the United States always associated slavery with race.
Yes.
Slavery, race, white. But that was not true until about the 15th or 16th century. In the ancient world, people were slaves all the time. So if you were Euclid, let's say you had a mind like Euclid and you were born a slave, and you said to your master, I teach your son, I can do math better, I deserve to be free. He would just said, whoever says slavery is based on merit.
Right.
It's based on your bad luck, get back to work. And because people looked alike, and the word slave comes from Slav, so the Ottomans, there was a sense, even as in the Byzantine Empire, that the Arabs brought black slaves from Europe after the 15th or 16th century. But in the West, there had not been this great outrage about slavery because it was an equal opportunity. Anybody could be enslaved, and there was no particular race that was.
Ours became it was colored.
Yes, and that was because of the age of exploration, when the and the British had to go around the Horn of Africa. They saw huge continents populated, and the idea that they don't have cities, have states, and said that they're inferior. This is what Aristotle was talking about all along, that there are people that are natural slaves, and then because of the New World and the climate, they said we can use, and that's how it all started. And so when you're trying to eliminate it, and you think you're going to go to Aristotle or Plato, or it's not going to be there, because they never had the concept that it was a particular person. When Aristotle said there should be natural slaves, that's an admission there weren't. And a lot of people said, well, the Thracians should be slaves, or the Gauls should be slaves. They're inferior, but it didn't work that way.
It never took.
Yeah.
The progressive critique. Give me a moment to set this up.
Yeah.
From the 2021 report of the President's 1776 Advisory Commission, on which you served, quote, instead of securing fundamental rights grounded in nature, the progressives at the turn of the last century held, government should constantly evolve to secure evolving rights. Government would be run more and more by credentialed managers who would direct society through rules and regulations that molded to the currents of the time. Before he became president, Woodrow Wilson laid out this new system whereby, quoting Wilson, the functions of government are in a very real sense independent of legislation and even constitutions, close quote. That was Woodrow Wilson more than a century ago. Here's a statement by the Center for Progressive Reform just a couple of years ago, quote, our Constitution not only permits the administrative state, it affirmatively requires it, close quote. So we have this progressive view developing around the turn of the last century that we're in a modern society. We've industrialized. We have people coming from in those days, largely European, although the Asian immigration to the West Coast had begun. This is new, this is different. We cannot be bound by the strictures of an 18th century document, which sounds plausible.
It does, if you, to make that progressive project work, you have to postulate that human nature is fluid and mutable. And therefore, when the physical circumstances change, people change themselves, and then you need a board of experts. And the idea came from 1870s and 1880s in France with the bureau and the directories and all of this heavy government and all of these papers about industrialization and the science of it, and man was changing. So if you believe that because nutrition, it would get better food, we have better health, then you say, if you just give me enough power and money, I can make a directorate and I can make a new man. It's the Soviet idea of a new man. That's a progressive thought. And the conservative says, man is innately flawed. He's never going to change. And because he's never going to change, he's going to be acquisitive. He's going to be tyrannical. And we're going to set up a system that allows people to be free, but protects the weak from the strong. And there's always going to be strong, and there's always going to be but we can mitigate that with this checks and balances, and then give people free initiative to create and make.
The administrative, or the conservative immediately spots the problem and says the administrative state is going to turn into a new form of tyranny.
Yes, he says he thinks if you just get, the administrator says, if you just give me enough power and money and all this new science that I know, I can do things. So COVID comes along and say, no, I'm the expert. I can tell you that this was created by a pangolin, and it's very infectious, and it's not like anything we've ever seen before, and you've got to give me the power to shut down the entire economy, put people in isolation for 2 years. And
to say Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins are unelected public health officials.
Yes, and then you give me the power and we can get through this. And people were saying, we have had plagues throughout history. Mass quarantines has never happened. You know what will happen. There will be people who cheat that have exemptions. There will be Gavin Newsom in the French Laundry. There'll be Nancy Pelosi getting her hair done. That's one thing. The second thing is you'll rob people of, it was the practical argument. Right. And we have confidence in our system of healthcare of 2,500 years. We know about quarantines. We'll find the data, see if children are susceptible as adults. If they're not, let the schools be open, because they, in a cost of benefit analysis, will do more damage. So there were these rational, and they would not do it. And anytime
Ron DeSantis pulled it off in Florida.
He did.
One of the rare examples.
He did. Right. And whenever this happens, the progressive administrator always relies on credentials, not on science, or not. They say that. I am the science. Fauci. Right. We got to do this. And they always want more power. And it leads to a diminishing of liberty, because what you want in a society, the conservative wants the protection of liberty and have all these different voices. So somebody comes up and he says, well, I'm sorry, I think Tom Cotton wrote an op-ed, they tried to sign it. Here's the Wuhan lab, and here's the first case, and all of a sudden the PLA is running the Wuhan lab, and they're stopping all flights out of Wuhan to China while they're letting flights go to SFO in LA. This is very similar, that they've never found a case over here with bats 100 miles away. They're right there. And it was obviously true, and they wanted to suppress it. We had all these different views that were critiquing the monolithic progressive view, and finally it just exploded.
So you are arguing that the 18th century document, those checks and balances, are even more important in this modern time than they were originally.
Well, I believe
Stick with the 18th century document.
But I think when you look at the history of America, that Constitution is what saved us. If I look at the people who drew it up, and I compare them to a Tim Walz or a Nancy Pelosi or any of these people on either party, I don't see anybody with that much intellect.
Tim Walz is no James Madison.
No. And Anthony Fauci is no Ben Franklin.
Victor, one more attack on the Constitution, an attack that has developed in recent years, on the founding, I should say, that has developed in recent years, and it's come from an unexpected quarter, the right. So we have a school of thought that has developed that rejects the notion of individual rights, or it rejects the idea of putting them at the center of government, and rejects the idea that government should derive legitimacy from the consent of the governed. Those ideas get dismissed as mere declarationism. And this school of thought wants a new revolution to establish a strong state determined to pursue a particular moral and religious vision. Less emphasis on more individual rights, more emphasis on the common good. That's the phrase often used. Patrick Deneen of Notre Dame, quote, "I increasingly fear that Americans will have to break with America and seek to refound the nation on better truths," close quote. You are identified as a man of the right. Do you buy
Are
this?
those called natcons?
Natcons. Do you buy this?
No,
not at all.
I buy their critiques about the excess, but I do it from a classical point of view. I can't think of a classical author, say in the 1st century AD, whether it's Suetonius' Life of the 12 Caesars, or Tacitus's Annals, or Catullus' poems, or Salus's history, or Petronius's novel, or Ovid's poem, where they were saying that affluence and leisure have corrupted Rome, and it was going to fall, and they had to do something. But it in the West, it stayed for another 500 years. What I'm getting at is those arguments that he's making now were made in the Roaring 20s, that women were doing in Charleston and people were not going to church. They were made by the North and said, we've got to change the system because these people in the South are just different people. Every time we've had that argument, the flexibility and the rigidity, that's kind of a oxymoron, but the ability we have an amendment system, we can add amendments to it, and we've done it often, and we have a Supreme Court that tries to, on the right at least, reflect the original intention, not so much on the left, but the system is capable of handling radical changes in technology. What they are saying is, well, the founders weren't alive when you could get on the internet and look at pornography. They weren't alive with the internet, social media. They weren't alive. And all of these things are so disruptive that we're now agnostic, atheist, secular. And we've got all these people who are completely decadent. And we've got to have a national religious, the founders didn't certify a national religion, but they implied one, Christianity. They were mostly deists. So we've got to emphasize that national collective religion, but
what was implicit must now be made explicit.
And they think they're in a time warp, that this only happened now. There were people who said, if we don't round up everybody from 1860 and 1870 from Eastern Europe and Italy, we're going to have Rome rebellion, and anarchism, and that was a big fear. There was this is all based on legitimate fears, but the anecdote is wrong. The system is anytime somebody offers a complete redirection of the Constitution or traditions, whether it's on the left or right, it's actually an indication or symptom of a lack of logic or poor thinking, because they should be thinking, what are the drivers of people walking into the subway and knocking somebody into a rail and killing them? What are the drivers of people looting? What are the drivers of people spending $50,000 a year on a student and he can't read? All of those can be done without altering any of our national...
They can all be addressed.
Yes, and they can be addressed by advocacy. If you think, well, we have to change everything about the border because we let 12,000 people come in a day under Biden,
Oh, I see, 12,000.
and it's impossible. It wasn't. Trump came in and he followed the law, and now there's zero coming in. So you can solve these gigantic problems if you use the existing jurisprudence, the legal system, the Congress, the executive, the Supreme Court. It works.
Victor, the notion of American empire. How we're doing. Last few questions on how we're doing today. So we have John Quincy Adams. You know where I'm going with this, I'm sure. In 1821, John Quincy Adams says the United States, that's right, is the well-wisher to the freedom of independence and all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. The United States goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy, close quote. George Washington warns against foreign entanglements. We have this notion, the founders seemed to, it's hard to argue, but you could argue. Pat Buchanan makes the argument. He wrote a book called A Republic, Not an Empire. On the other hand, you have Thomas Jefferson tangling with the Barbary pirates, clear on the other side of the world very early in the history of this country. Still, how can the American founding be reconciled with a state that now has 800 military facilities scattered around the world? A virtual protectorate in Venezuela, a hot war in Iran, and on and on.
Well, I think Donald Trump got elected because he said there would be no forever wars. And that was a direct reference really to two wars. The 20-year misadventure in Afghanistan and Iraq, where we spent aggregately $2 trillion and we lost 7,000 or 8,000 soldiers and probably 50 to 80,000 wounded. And the results were not in a cost-benefit analysis. It ended up with, $50 billion of sophisticated hardware in the hands of the Taliban
in Afghanistan.
$1 billion embassy sacrifice, a big new air base at Bagram, refitted, given away. It was a disaster. So he said we're not an empire. And then he came in and he said, these are people who are trying to either destroy us or our allies, and they project power. And it was the post 9/11. So he looked at Soleimani, and people said he had killed all these people in Afghanistan and Iraq with shaped charges, and he's now plotting to he's creating a Tehran, Damascus, Beirut, Gaza, Houthi axis. And it's going to be someday cut off the Red Sea, cut off the... So they took him out very quickly. And then they came to him and said...
The Trump administration.
Yes. And then they came and said, al-Baghdadi is killing people and he's going to destroy whatever chance Iraq has. He's gobbled... So they bombed ISIS out. No Americans killed, nothing. And he didn't reply. The Iranians sent a little missile over. He said they needed to get out of their system. And then the Wagner group, the Russians tried to storm a group of our soldiers in Syria, and he wiped them out one day. And then next time he came around, Maduro, he kidnapped him, extradited him one day. So then everybody was fine with that. He's not after an empire. He's just selectively as an Anglo-Jacksonian using American power to eliminate the possibility of war. He's not bombing 9 months, 7 months in Libya for nothing. He's not like Bill Clinton taking all the bridges out of the Danube and taking the power grid out of Belgrade because French and Britain, that they wanted him to do that. And then this happened. He takes out
Iran.
Yes, June of last year, he takes out the nuclear facilities in one day. And then he's done. All of his current critics today, Tucker Carlson was temporarily critical of World War III, he said, but I think when it didn't happen, he reconciled. And then Megyn Kelly was big for it. You didn't have that. And then he went back. And now he bombed for 32 days. And now there's been 40 days of something like that, of off-on negotiations. And that now we've lost 13 people. Probably spent $40 billion. But what I'm getting at is, he thought, and I'm not trying to say that I agree or disagree, but I do agree with him, but he's saying that this was an existential threat, and in a cost-benefit analysis, we can neutralize it without the cost of an Afghanistan or Iraq that did not work. We have no nation, we're not going to nation build, we're not going to have ground troops, but we're going to eliminate their ability to make war. And then when he says he does that, the Middle East, for the first time in a very different way, has a chance. So if somebody said, the UAE is asking Israel to help it provide missile defense against another Muslim country, nobody would have believed that. And so the installations all over the world, if you talk to people in the military, they will say, go look at where they are. There are places in the Red Sea, there are places near Gibraltar and Morocco, there are places in Panama Canal, there are places near the Bosphorus, there's places where there's choke points all over the world. And our job, because nobody else will do it, is to keep the waterways open. And that's what the Strait of Hormuz controversy is about. But without I don't think people realize that after World War II, the U.S. Navy was larger than all the other navies of the world put together. And we inherited this role from the British Empire. And we kept commerce. It was very expensive. And Trump is now saying, we're not going to do it anymore unless we get help. But the reason that Europe spent 1.3% on defense, 550 million people, the greater Europe, for 40 years was the United States. And so everybody got accustomed to this role that we were playing. And then when it went south, Vietnam or Afghanistan or Iraq, people started to question that. And so Trump was trying to say, how can you be a Jacksonian and not how can you look at problems that are going to hurt us down the road and deal with them in their infancy before they mature without being an interventionist and a nation builder? And that's very hard to do.
Donald Trump himself, second term, he has a little less than 3 years left to run.
Yes.
Two quotations. Former President Joe Biden, quote, "Donald Trump is the greatest threat to our democracy in history," close quote. And here's the late Vice President Richard Cheney, a Republican and by all accounts a conservative. Quote, "There has never been an individual who is a greater threat to our republic than Donald Trump," close quote. I don't want to go into, Lord knows, I want to ask about the founding, but is Trump an instrument of the republic's decline? Or is there in some way a revival taking place? You refer to Andrew Jackson, his early 19th century Trump, though you go back to our own history for a model
Andrew
here.
Jackson, I mean, he said that if South Carolina opposed the tariff, he was going to invade it. And he said that the Chief Justice, he was going to ignore what, we've had this before, but what I don't mind people saying that at all, but I do mind when they don't give you an example. So when I hear he's a tyrant or a dictator, I say, here's the classical definition of a tyrant. Let me go down checks and balances. Okay, has he weaponized the FBI to try to destroy a presidential candidate? We know that happened in 2000. No. Is he galvanizing, say, in the White House in one day, in a 24-hour period, is a prosecutor coming from Georgia indicting Barack Obama, and he's in the White House. This is Nathan Wade. And then the third member of the DOJ is leaving that day to go work with Alvin Bragg to go get another political person. And then that same day, Merrick Garland is appointed a special prosecutor to conduct the raid. And then the same day, for some reason, Letitia James is in there, all in the same day. Or is he saying, I think we've got to change the system. I think we've got to pack the court. I think we've got to get rid of the Electoral College. I think we've got to get a bigger court now that I'm in power. We need more conservative judges. We own the Senate. Let's get rid of the filibuster. He's not doing that. You could argue that maybe
he has said that he wants them to get rid of the filibuster.
Yeah, he says that, but he doesn't call them up and say do it, and they wouldn't do it anyway if he did.
Right.
And then the recalibration, the redistricting, he said in Texas they do that, but that was a reply of for years, you know that people have been saying New Hampshire, Delaware, Massachusetts, there's not one Republican congressional seat. And I think
it hasn't been for a quarter of a century.
Yeah, and yet the Republicans vote 45% in every election. So that was a reaction against it. But I can't see, people just the other day said, well, he's controlling I think it was Barack Obama said, he's controlling the DOJ. We don't really know who the DOJ is. And I don't know who he was, but I do remember that Eric Holder said to the country...
Barack Obama's Attorney General.
Yes,
Eric
he
Holder.
said, I am the president's wingman, and I got to take care of my boy. I thought that was kind of a condescending term. And so when they say this, I say, well, is he refusing congressional subpoena? No. I mean, when Steve Bannon did, they put him in jail and prosecuted him. When Eric Holder did, they did nothing. When Merrick Garland said, I'm not going to go to Congress, they did nothing. So I just like to see some evidence, not the rhetoric, because Trump has all this excessive rhetoric, but just see, compared to the last oppositional party's administration, and then, because they're the ones that were saying this, just show me examples where he said, I might want a third term. Well, he's not going to have a third term. There's no way in the world he's going to have a third term. He's baiting and trolling people. But I don't see anything there that would suggest, if he said tomorrow, I think Joe Biden might want to run again, or Bill Clinton, I don't know. I'm going to have a raid on his house. Or Joe Biden had documents, he never really explained, let's go to his house and raid them, as they did Mar-a-Lago. I would be upset. Or there's a new thing that he's guilty of Chinese collusion, and let's investigate Kamala Harris or somebody. I don't see that. If they say he's going after his enemies.
Donald Trump, may I sum this up?
Yeah.
If it's fair, I mean, you correct me. Donald Trump has a big mouth.
Yes.
But he is not behaving like a tyrant.
No, he's not. He's I guess what he says is rambling, confused, contradictory. It's showmanship. And they look at one word and they say he's a tyrant, but if you look at what the founders wrote, or what classical literature says about a tyrant, the tyrant is not a bombastic person who's transparent. He's someone who's very quiet. And read Machiavelli, and he knows exactly what he's going to do. He's more like a Barack Obama, or someone who is careful, charismatic, says he's not a tyrant, he loves democracy, and then starts to do. Donald Trump hasn't surveyed the Associated Press reporters like Obama did. He didn't bring in people into his office and say, I know there's no evidence for collusion, but you, Brennan, you, Comey, you, Clapper, go back and find me and bring back a report that shows that this man is colluding with Russia.
From Trump and Barack Obama to the rest of us. This is you in your book, Victor Davis Hanson and the Dying Citizen, and you're writing about a survey that was conducted in 2017. Most Americans appeared ignorant of the fundamentals of the U.S. Constitution. 37% could not name a single right protected by the First Amendment. Only 1 out of 4 Americans could name all 3 branches of government. 1 in 3 could not name any branch of government. All right. Since 2017, one of the striking changes in the United States, although it hasn't happened at the federal level, so it tends to be underreported, in my opinion, is the growth in charter schools and voucher programs. In Florida today, more than half of students attend schools other than the public schools in their own districts. Are you optimistic?
Yes,
You are.
I am very optimistic. I'm a little worried that that model you're talking about, and we could even say the public schools in Mississippi have higher test scores than California. But this reaction to go back to traditional education, civic education, is being...
It's real. It's happening across the country.
And then you have the headquarters of places like Hillsdale College. It has all of these paradigms, and it's devoting a lot of its resources for the K through 12. And there's a lot of people like Hillsdale. And it's working so well that when you talk to people, and we're having the greatest migration in the history of the United States, internal migration. We've never seen anything like it. It makes the Oklahoma diaspora look small, of the 1930s.
People are headed to Texas and Florida and
it's
Tennessee.
Now
to red states.
300,000 from California around. They used to be, it's about 1 to 3 million every year now. And they are leaving what was the most sophisticated. If we had this discussion in 1920 or 30, it was the northern industrial states, New England, and by 1940, the West was where the industry was, the universities were, and they're abandoning that area, that whole area and region, and they're going why? They want strict constitutional government. They want crime stopped and people jail after trial and fair trials and in jail. They want a school that type you mentioned, and they want physical sobriety, and they're doing it in such.
And they want lower taxes.
Yes, and the problem is that we've never really seen the United States so sectarian based on geography since 1850, when you had North-South slavery. But what you do now, when I go to a red state, it's completely antithetical to Portland or Seattle or Minneapolis. And the blue state model, if you look at just empirically, they have large deficits. They have higher taxes. Their infrastructure is declining because they're spending an enormous amount of money that's very poorly audited and oversaw on social programs. They have more homeless. They have more people, illegal aliens. They have more crime. And it's equally amazing because many of these places have so much more natural bounty than the places they're going to. Why would a person in California that used to have the 5th largest oil and gas in the United States, still does, the 2nd greatest timber industry, still has the greatest farming industry, why would they leave to a place with, I love Nevada, but I mean it's not very rich? And the answer is that people feel that the blue paradigm, not the Democratic Party of old, this isn't John Kennedy, or it's not Bill Clinton either. Bill Clinton balanced the budget for 4 years. Bill Clinton said if a juvenile commits a felony, a murder, he should be tried by it. And he said, we're all for immigration if it's legal, measured, and diverse. We do not want it. That was this campaign that I think was written by Mr. Penn, his advisor, and a couple of other, Mark Halpern, I think. They helped draft the 92 and 96 convention. And if you read that today...
The platform, the
Yes, it almost platform. Is... There's a lot of Trump similarities. So this is a new Jacobin party, and it's doing things to these areas that are going way beyond the norms of most people. And they haven't got their hands around 3 genders. They haven't got their hands around open borders. They haven't got their hands around 12 million people entering in 4 years, 10,000 a day. They haven't got their hands around a guy tries to chop somebody in the subway and he's out the next day to push somebody in. They can't process that. They pay all this taxes and then they don't see superior roads or schools. And so I pay 13% taxes to California, and it's harder for me to drive 50 years later from my farm to here. Even the infrastructure hasn't changed a bit.
But what you're saying is that what's likely to save the country is an aspect of the Constitution itself,
Yes.
this 18th century federalism.
Exactly.
States' rights have been eroded in all kinds of ways over these centuries, but there's still enough there for Texas and Florida and Tennessee to demonstrate a very different model.
And the Federals said that in the Federalist Papers. They said the wonderful thing about the federalism, it let each of these states compete without federal, strangulation, and they can, along the lines of the Constitution, which is predominant, at least it was until recently, versus states' rights, but they would have a unique culture, and then people could pick and choose which paradigm would work, and they were free to migrate back and forth, and they did so. But now there's been a consensus. It's not left or right, because when I go to red states and I see people from California, half of them are left, and they're leaving for basic reason. I can't afford it. I can't buy a house. I can't afford insurance.
Right.
And so that's going to be dangerous, because that red state, and with it's going to be very interesting, because with the Supreme Court on the taboo on racial segregation, and I think that Democrats may have miscalculated to get into a redistricting war, because the majority of the states have Republican legislatures, and people have suggested that if they go full nuclear and each side goes full nuclear on redistricting to the ultimate degree, the Republicans will pick up 10 seats. And if the census goes as it is, they're going to pick up another 10 or 15 seats. So you could see
From the 2030 census.
yes, from the census and the redistricting because of race,
Because
and
everybody's moving to Texas and Florida.
Yeah, well, yeah, you could see a 40-seat change. and that would make the Democratic Party sort of like the Republican minority party of the 50s, 60s, 70s. And I don't think people understand what's going on there.
Victor, last question. You and I are talking today, just a couple of days before President Trump is to leave for a summit meeting in China. And this July, we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So it's a question about where we stand right now. And here's a story from this morning's New York Times on the way China looks at the United States. For decades, many Chinese viewed the United States with a mix of admiration, envy, and resentment. President Trump's volatile second term shattered that image. China increasingly views America as in decline. Are the Chinese right?
No, it's just the opposite. I mean, if you look at the world right now, under, I would say, the last 13 or 14 years, China's Belt and Road, they thought that pretty soon the Western Hemisphere was going to be theirs. They had economic outposts in Venezuela, in Colombia, in Bolivia, Peru. They had entry and exit points at the Panama Canal. And they've been thrown out now of Venezuela. There's a conservative government in Argentina. There's one in Chile. They're starting to reappear, and the Monroe Doctrine is starting to be reapplied. And they are
Monroe Doctrine says this hemisphere belongs to the United States.
And China is not buying sanctioned oil at a discount from a Western Hemisphere. If you look at the Middle East, they had the same type of agenda, and they were buying sanctions. They have no toehold, nor does Russia. Russia doesn't have a toehold. They lost Syria, they lost Iran. So, and then you look at militarily, you look at their weapons that were supposed to be ironclad in Iraq. They were incompetent. They didn't work. This has enormous consequences for Taiwan. They look at the Russians, who have similar weapons as their own, and they can't take Ukraine. They look at what the United States did against their air defenses, and that shocked them. They look at drones and this new technology and say, how are we going to get 110 miles from the mainland to Taiwan with a sea and air of drones? So, and then you look at their economy. We were told they were going to surpass us now. Their GDP is about 21 trillion and we're about 30. So if you do just by the population, they have 1.4 billion people, we have 340. So roughly one American, I'm talking about all ages, just roughly, one American produces 30% more goods and services than China, than his Chinese counterpart, economically. If you look at the system politically, here we're having really a lot of anger that Pete Hegseth canned 3 or 4 iconic generals that, for different reasons. Xi just went in without any discussion, wiped out the whole class of his military and fired them, and they're probably not going to be heard from. And when you look at immigration, nobody wants to go to China. There's no immigration. Nobody's saying, I got to get into China. And they still want to get into the United States. If you look at the top 10 countries, corporations in the world based on market capitalization, 8 of 10 are American. If you look at chief fields of chief technological or scientific fields, cryptocurrency, robotics, genetic engineering, AI, the United States is at either leading all of them or at one. If you look at how China is achieving near parity in some, it's because they have 300,000 students here. And I've taught them at Pepperdine and other places.
Chinese nationals
Yes.
studying in this country.
And they're here to appropriate American technology, science, STEM courses, and go back and replicate it in China. So it's a derivative culture. And they're never going to be able to catch up because they have a closed system, and how you advance as a surgeon or as a scientist will be based on ideology. It's sort of like the Islamic world. Whereas here, I think 4 out of the top companies by market capitalization are foreign born. I mean, there's a problem with that if they're not fully acclimatized, acculturated, integrated, and assimilated. And their first loyalty, we had a mayor today, and I think it was in Orange County, it was working for the Chinese. But we had a member of the Stanford faculty, lecturer, I think, that was a member of the People's Liberation Army yearly appointment, neuroscientist, as I remember. But by and large, we're an open, free society, and we draw talent all over the world, and we're ahead of them. And I mean, they don't have anything like Elon Musk. His rockets, one man in the United States is making more sophisticated rockets than their whole country. And so I don't see that.
And it's because it traces right back to the founding.
It does.
250 years ago.
They created the system.
The reason that we can maintain our dominance even today, there's no notion of decline. There's no way in which this country is spent and simply sinking in some way. It remains vibrant because I'm asking this. I'm putting this in the form of a question. Because of the liberty that that notion of liberty that you already quite carefully defined, that sophisticated but basic notion of liberty that the Declaration and the Constitution enshrined.
It has, and people have a good idea, they're free to go pursue it. If they want to go to a different state, they go. If they want to change, you look at the Times educational supplement of the top 50 universities, and believe me, they're not fans of America. Of course, they have
the people
Oxford
put together
and Cambridge, but I mean, it's always Caltech or MIT, and then they'll sneak in Cambridge or Oxford, but then it's Harvard, Yale, Princeton, or Stanford. California alone has 5 universities in their top 50. Stanford, Caltech, USC, UCLA, and UC Berkeley. And I think of the top 50, 40 of them are American. There's 2 Chinese. So we are educating the elite of the world, and about a quarter of them don't leave. And so I don't see, and I look at every little aspect. Agriculture, we have the most sophisticated food producing sector in the world, and we have a fraction of the acreage of China, and in the value of our food, it's more valuable.
Yes.
We look at oil. We're the greatest oil and gas exporter and producer in history. We're exporting more oil than China, than Russia and Saudi Arabia combined, and we were supposed to have reached peak oil. So then, fuel, food, defense, we spend more, not that it's always well spent, but we spend more than the next 20 countries put together. And when you look at the quality of weapons and the people in the military and what they did in Venezuela, it's just mind-boggling if there's good strategic and tactical leadership. So, and I'm not a big fan of the universities, but the universities in math and science and medicine, not law, but the rest of them, they're the best in the world and recognizes that. And when you look at technology, where did the iPhone, where did the computer, where did the electric car really take off? It's almost every single thing comes from America.
So Victor, last question. 250 years after the Declaration of Independence, you still like our chances?
Yes, I think I'm very happy that I have 2 children. I think they're going to live in a much better life than I had. And I had a much better life as far as ordeal than my parents. I think we're all worried of the Roman and Greek warning that the more affluent and leisured a person becomes, the more prone they are to satisfy their appetites in destructive ways, as if it's legally sanctioned, that means you should do it where it be morally not sanctioned, right? And so and the founders were very clear about that in peripheral writings, that religion, community, popular morality, these were all very necessary in a country that could become so wealthy and so free. To restrict people from doing what was legal, but
bad for them.
Yeah, bad for them and bad for the country. That's our biggest problem right now. That we have so many opportunities because of our wealth and our leisure and our empathy, that people act out things that are destructive to themselves because there's no moral guidance. But you don't want a national religion. You want religion to step up. And I think we're starting to see there too, Peter, that a young generation is starting to be more religiously observant than my generation was. And so I'm very confident. I'm not just Pollyanna. There's a lot of things wrong that are going on, but I think they're being addressed.
Victor Davis Hanson, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
For Uncommon Knowledge, the Hoover Institution, and Fox Nation, I'm Peter Robinson.
Subscribing to iCatholic Mobile, you help fund programs that connect you to everything Catholic and provide that lifeline to others in need. With every dollar earned, a portion goes to Catholic media, education, and the formation of souls. Join today at iCatholicMobile.com.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Today we are celebrating the external solemnity of the Feast of St. Peter and St. Paul. The feast proper is on June 29th, the day that they both suffered martyrdom in Rome. But we are celebrating the feast again today with external solemnity to give greater glory to God, so that everyone in the community may take part. In the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 16, our Lord Jesus Christ speaks to St. Peter. He said, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." In this passage, our Lord is making St. Peter the spiritual leader of his church. Our Lord is establishing the papacy. St. Peter is to be the first pope, his first spiritual representative in an unbroken line of popes until the end of the world. Indeed, it is a historical fact that St. Peter was the first pope, and it is also a historical fact that Pope Benedict XVIII, our current pontiff, can trace his lineage back in an unbroken line all the way back to Peter and Peter to Jesus. In fact,